My name is Mike Burns. I'm a partner in the transport and logistics team at Weightmans Solicitors. We're a UK law firm and we advise clients in the transport sector. Is it possible to Brexit-proof existing contracts? The situation we're faced with potentially a no-deal Brexit is that the landscape and the laws are potentially changing, and we have to look to, or operators have to look to their existing contract to see how they will fit to that changed landscape. In terms of changing contracts, that's probably unlikely because contracts tend to be set in stone. It's fair to say contracts all shapes and sizes, from long-term contracts to short call-off type contracts to contracts on the basis of purchase orders. So it's a question not so much of changing contracts, but looking how flexible your contracts are, looking what's in the contracts, the detail of those contracts, to see if there are potential get-outs or flexibilities which will enable you to engage with your contractual partners if the impact of Brexit is such that that contract might become more, or looks like it could become more difficult or more expensive to perform. So it's really what is in the contract at the moment and being sure of your rights and obligations and the flexibilities that may or may not exist. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, if you're negotiating a contract which is going to span for the years ahead, then the current sort of changes have been very well signposted by UK government and industry bodies in terms of change to tariffs, pricing, licensing changes, movement of labour. All of these things will impact on the nuts and bolts of contracts. So any operators who are negotiating need to be mindful of the contracts will need to build in flexibility to deal with potential sharing of these risks, which we're aware of, in terms of whether it's ability to reprice or renegotiate contracts at a certain point, or going down the road if contracts become simply too onerous for one of other parties to provide for termination or renegotiation events. But it will very much depend on the interests of each party to the contract. Some parties may not feel that's necessary, others may feel more exposed, and it's a question of negotiating in terms which will react to the changing landscape and rules. With contract auditing and supply chain mapping, what we're saying now is that it's sensible for operators in the sector, whether you're a manufacturer, a distributor, a haulier, a freight forwarder, a warehouser, to look at your contractual relationships as they stand now, whether that's in terms of long-term contracts or shorter-term relationships, and read those contracts. Take your time to work out where your exposures are. Are you exposed by a no-deal Brexit in terms of pricing implications, new tariffs, delays at the ports, interference with your delivery obligations, because that will have a knock-on effect on your bottom line. So by reviewing your contracts, bringing in experts if necessary to have a sort of a helicopter view of where those exposures may lie, that will enable you to either see if there are remedies within the contracts for you to address or make use of, or to, if you feel that your contractual structure exposes you in some way, it may enable you to reach out, have conversations with your contractual partners about the difficulties and seeing how they can be resolved by way of amendment to the contract, renegotiation, or whatever. So it's a question of looking in your own backyard in terms of what your contracts are, but looking further afield to your contracting partners and seeing what they're doing, because the supply chain it's all connected up, and difficulties in one area of the supply chain in terms of a contractual breach, for example, could well have impact down the road on your operations, and therefore having conversations and understanding what your partners in the contractual chain are doing to address no-deal Brexit will make for a more joined-up approach in insulating each other's interests. What about Brexit clauses? It all sounds very exciting. Lots of clients come to us, particularly post March. But prior to March this year, when no-deal Brexit really reared its head, and wanting their contracts, their future contracts, not their current contracts, Brexit-proofed. In other words, to having clauses installed which may protect them in terms of their performance obligations or their price and payment obligations in the event that the fallout from a no-deal Brexit could impact on the contract. In other words, to give them flexibility to deal with the knowns and unknowns of a no deal, whether in terms of, as I say, increased pricing, supply chain delays, and so forth. Really looking ahead. There's an element of crystal ball gazing about it in terms of what parties can reasonably do. Really factoring in clauses and protections, and also dealing with things like area of operation, to factor in the fact that the UK will no longer be part of the EU any longer, to make sure that the contracts will correspond to the new legal landscape. With force majeure clauses, they're often contained in many contracts, where there is often there's a shopping list of events which will enable parties to be relieved from their obligations. Now, typically those events are sort of act of God type events, earthquakes, natural disasters, embargoes, seizure of assets, that kind of thing. And it would be unusual for a force majeure event to include a change in legislation that's been known about, or an impact from a change of legislation. That isn't to say force majeure won't kick in. It'd be a question of looking at the clause you have in your contract to see if that could include a Brexit type or a no deal fallout, and to try and use that to your advantage. Similarly with frustration, similar type of concept. Frustration is an English law concept which enables parties to, again, be relieved of their contractual obligations if an unforeseen event arises which parties couldn't do their own due diligence have ever prevented. Now, the difficulty here with a no-deal Brexit is that post-2016, when we had the referendum, we've all known about the Brexit as a possibility, and therefore it's not an unforeseen event. And simply because circumstances may make contracts more difficult, more expensive to perform, doesn't frustrate the contract. That may be unfair on one party, but that's just the way it is. Frustration is all about impossibility of performance. So there may be circumstances where the argument could be raised in the sort of post no deal scenario. But again, it's checking what your contract does say and to see if that might be a possible get out. But there are no get out of jail free cards available necessarily.